Colocasias, also commonly known as elephant ears. I've been growing and collecting these plants now for over 10 years in my UK tropical style garden, and the question I get asked most of all is how to overwinter them. Well, there's not one answer, there's lots of different methods, and in this video we're going to look into the different methods to do it, so please join me. Right, I'm at my potting bench in my greenhouse, and the first and probably most important thing we need to talk about when overwintering is variety. This really is key to how you treat them during the winter months. So basically it depends on their origins, and sometimes they're hybriding. As a basic rule, the greener varieties tend to be hardy. This isn't in every case, but they tend to be much more cool tolerant or hardy. So for instance, Colocasia pink china and Colocasia gaoligonensis would be, for most people in the UK especially, with a mulch in free draining soil, would be probably hardy enough to come through most winters. Some of these other green varieties, like for instance Colocasia green ruffles, this one's Colocasia bikini teeny, this one is mammoth, along with quite a few of the other green varieties I would call my cool tolerant plants. They don't seem to struggle as much to come out of dormancy. They do need heat, but probably not as much as some of these more tropical ones, so that makes them easier to overwinter. For instance, for me, green ruffles is a really heavy clumper. This is in a free draining mix of compost and perlite, and generally in my frost free greenhouse I could just now leave that, stop watering it, and leave just with the amount of moisture that it has in. It will slowly die down. I will cut the leaves off, cut the stems off, and that would probably most likely in spring just come back when the heat of the greenhouse sort of warms right up. That will come out of dormancy and start growing. I also tend to find that happens with bikini teeny, similar plants like dark stem hybrid or metallica, which is also sort of known as burgundy stem. They are a little bit different, but them plants and with the Colocasia esculenta can quite often just come back from the pot without you doing too much other than cutting them down, as long as they're kept in a greenhouse on the drier side. But we're going to talk about methods of probably improving that scenario to make that a little bit better. Then we've got the more tropical ones. These tend to be like mojito here, and then like the Alpeio, Milky Way. So we also have a diamond head there and a red-eyed gecko. These, if they're generally variegated, coloured, black-leafed, in a lot of cases these would probably need more heat to get them started in summer. And because they're more tropical, in a lot of cases they don't ever actually go dormant in their natural environment, so they don't build up the corm size that some of these other varieties will. And that being the case, because they've not evolved to deal with dormancy as well, the corms tend to rot really easy, and in some cases the corm just is not substantial enough to be able to bring them back out of dormancy. So we'll look at a slightly different method for them. I just need to mention the difference probably between growing Colocasia elephant ears in the UK compared to the US. In general, in the UK, we have maybe not as cold a temperatures as a lot of your zones over there, but what we do get is dull, wet, long winters without the summer heat that you get. And that is probably the key, that for us, these Colocasias are sat in wet soil for a very, very long time. And in general, because we don't get hot springs or hot summers that can bring them out of the dormancy before they rot, that tends to be the case, because lots of these Colocasias in the US will come back with maybe a mulch over them, because your summer heat will bring them back out of dormancy before they rot. That does happen in some cases in the UK with some varieties, but as a general rule, we tend to bring them in. We tend to try and keep them overwintered in various methods, basically to try not to risk them rotting and dying. Right, so I've just dug up this Colocasia from the garden. Basically, I've cut all the top leaves off, leaving just this emerging leaf to the stem. And then what I did is I shook off all the soil, and then I have put it in a bucket of water and rinsed all the way around the bottom to remove all soil from around the roots and around the base of this corm. So this is the corm at the bottom, which is almost like a bulb, and this is what stores the energy for it during its dormancy stage to then recover next year. So this one I'm actually not going to dry store because it's not my preferred method, but for people with a lack of room, it probably makes more sense to dry store them. So if I wanted to dry store this, I would probably leave it now, maybe on some newspaper or in a cardboard box, to dry for about a week, to slowly die down. Then I would cut off all these roots. You could cut off the roots before, but I just like things to sort of naturally sort of just die off. Hopefully it sends signals to the plant that it needs to go into dormancy. So after about a week, we're going to cut off all the roots. We're going to cut this stem at about this height. So this is pretty much the growing point, the top of the corm, and we want to probably go just above that. And then we can just store that then in a cardboard box with maybe shredded newspaper or newspaper. If we have maybe 4 or 5 of these, we could put in the box. Don't let them touch, because sometimes that can cross sort of contaminate and we can get mold issues where they're touching. What you do need to do is you need to thoroughly check usually the bottom of the corm and feel it and make sure that it's solid all the way around. If there's any soft spots, that will be where it rots away. So what you want to do then is thoroughly clean off any soft spots, maybe even slice off with a little bit of knife to make sure you've got nice sort of white fleshy material and no sort of browning. If you do have that, you then need to sort of make sure that that's left for a few days to almost callus over before you sort of store it. So I don't actually like to use that method. I tend to use what's called the dormancy method, which is pretty much what you see now is how I would deal with it. So basically a really free draining compost mix like this. I'm going to add this to a pot. Try to use one of the smallest pots that you can get it into. Now, the more tropical the Colocasia, okay, the slightly different method I would use, and especially with smaller corms or smaller plants. But for this one and a plant this size, I would basically put it into a really free draining mix of perlite and compost. Get all them roots in there. This is really tricky, by the way, to do just for one hand. Let's throw some more of this free draining mix in. There is also, if you see these little orange bits, they're just some clay pebbles that will sort of in the mix as well. They aren't doing no harm because it allows it to be really free draining still. Okay, so I'm basically just going to do that. Make sure it's well pushed in all the way around. This compost has a slight bit of moisture in it already. It's not totally dried out, which is absolutely sort of ideal. Okay, so I'm basically trying to cover the corm, go to the top of the pot. So with that now, I am happy to leave that in my frost-free greenhouse, keeping an eye on it for making sure there's no mold or anything like that. But you could also now store this in maybe a summer house or somewhere frost-free, somewhere in the house, probably nowhere too warm, because you don't actually want it growing. So maybe sort of below 10 degrees Celsius. I'll put up on the screen what that is in Fahrenheit. But I prefer this method. You could also cut this somewhere about here. You don't have to have it where the leaf's emerging, but you do want to try and keep probably some of the stem, because there's an emerging leaf in there. And next year, the reason I prefer this dormancy method is it's so much easier to get them started again next year with some heat. When you go right back to the dry store method, it can take quite a bit of time to sort of get them back into growth. I've always found that this way they can grow much quicker. So make sure you label it, because once it's not got a leaf on, if you've got quite a few of these, you're not going to know what variety it is. I'm now going to show another method very similar, but just one that I tend to use more for the tropical varieties and the ones with smaller corms, because I'm just being over preventive that I may not cause rot. Next, we have a bit of a tatty Colocasia redemption. In the US, this has been known to be hardy for some people in zone 7s. For us here in the UK, with our cold wet winters, I really don't believe that would ever be the case. So for me, I would treat this like I would the more tender and Hawaiian ones. So let's have a little look what we've got in here. It's already been potted up into a very free draining mix, because that's just how I tend to always pot mine up anyway, because if I need extra water into the pot, I can always put that pot in a tray. So let's get into it. I normally wouldn't have to do this one-handed while holding a camera. So what we got, if we looked at the size of the pot it was in, and now to actually the size of the pot it could fit in. So we're going from, that's what it was in, which is fine when it's trying to grow in the growing season. But what we can actually do now is get a little 9cm pot or smaller, depending on what it fits in, and we could pot it up into that if it will fit. If not, go a little bit bigger. But again, this under here, under this corm, has got lots and lots of compost and wet sticky stuff that's probably going to slowly rot into this base. Here we have these offshoots, which the tops may die off, and we will cut these little, or break these little bits off. We may gain them, we may not. They are not ready to be separated and grown on in like as houseplants or anything. They're just a bit too small. So we've now got the redemption like that. What I can do next is I would probably cut nearly all these roots off, because I know it's a bit more of a sort of a heat loving plant. So what I don't want is these roots to slowly just rot away in the mix I'm going to give it. So that will be my next thing. And then what I will do is I will just trim off any of these little tatty bits here, or anything that I think could potentially rot away. And then I'm going to cut off this plant at about this height, probably leave maybe sort of 4 or 5 inches of stem. Okay, so I've cut off some of the roots from the bottom. I've cleaned up any sort of dead or old material from around the base of this stem to sort of prevent or help prevent any rot that may get into here. Now what we've done is we've got another small pot, and what I've done is the bottom quarter of that pot I've used a perlite and compost mix, which is really aerated. It would be free draining, and I've just put that in the bottom quarter. Then what I used to do is I used to put this corm inside with the little offshoots, and then I would backfill that with compost and perlite. Now this is still a very good feasible method, and I'm not going to knock it in any way. The only thing I would say is sometimes if the moisture levels are a bit wrong in your mix, you can sort of cause more sort of contamination around the corm because of that, and maybe increase the chances of the corm rotting or the stem rotting. So what I tried last year was I got some of these clay pebbles, which you should be able to get online, and they're often used like a leca type thing for house plants. And what I've done is I've used them to do this top layer around the corm. So for instance, if I grab a handful of them and I put them in, now what I would normally do, put plenty round, sorry about the camera work, and then I would lift that because I don't actually want the bottom of the corm on the compost. So I've lifted it so a load of these clay pebbles will go under it, but I'm still keeping the top of this under the top of the pot. So with that, I'm going to carry on. Putting plenty of these clay pebbles round. And I'm not saying this is how you have to do it. I'm just saying this is a method that I've used to try to help prevent that rot around that corm a bit more. So I'm just pushing it around, and I'm just going to make sure the sort of top of the corm's covered like that. So basically now what I'm going to do with that is just store it somewhere in this greenhouse. I'm for now going to leave this leaf on because I'm going to let that just die off. This is going to dry out now, that's going to die back, and as it starts to die, before it gets any fungal issues or causes me any problems, I will just cut it back about here. And then, like I said before, keep an eye on it. I can water that now because I know that the water would actually sort of drain straight through that and just leave the bottom bit slightly damp. If it was later in the year, I probably wouldn't do that. I would probably literally, if you're being on the safe side, probably just not water that now. But like I say, you do need to keep an eye on it because you want to make sure that this doesn't get any rot on it along the stem. So that's another method that I like to use. Like I say, you could use the compost and perlite completely right the way to the top and not use these clay pebbles. It's just my preferred method to help prevent any contamination or rot around the corm. I know now that even if I have to water that, which I don't really, if this plant is dormant, it's not really going to need any water until it gets the heat. So for me, I'm quite confident now, keeping an eye on temperatures, that will do all right. Right, so I've got 3 here potted up in that style. We've got this Mojito, we've got the Redemption, and we've got Black Ripple, all in these small pots in that same free draining mix, or another free draining mix of your choice. You may choose to have it all compost and perlite. You may choose to maybe add some grit, whichever. I like perlite because it makes it very light and aerated. If you choose, you can grow these, which I would recommend for some of these tropical plants, especially like a Mojito, maybe a Black Magic, a Nancy's Revenge, them type of varieties. They are ideally best kept ticking over, so just in growth. So you put these on a sunny windowsill. You could use this same sort of mix and a tray underneath and just water sparingly just to keep them growing. It is all about temperature. Colocasias, the more tropical ones, generally under sort of 12 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Celsius, may start to go dormant, especially if they're on the drier side. So if you want to keep them growing, you probably need to keep them at room temperature, which is about 20 Celsius. Be aware that keeping them going, you may get red spider mites. You need to keep an eye on that, and things like aphids. which may need to be dealt with. You might need to sort of cut the odd dead leaf off, or keep wiping them down, or use whichever method you prefer to get over them problems. The sort of benefit to that is some of these plants, because they're very tropical, they haven't got really good substantial corms that store the energy well. They rot really easy, and by keeping them growing, come spring, when the light sort of levels increase and we can add a little bit more water and it's a bit warmer, we haven't got to try to give them all this additional heat to get them out of dormancy. They're already just growing, so they will be ready to go. Obviously, you know, come space, if you've got a lot of varieties like I have here, then you're going to have to use a lot of the dormancy method. But I do also keep so many of them growing through winter, because I'm trying to bulk them up and just keep them sort of healthy. I have done another video on my channel, like a collector's guide to growing Colocasias, sort of getting them through winter. That uses grow lights, heat, talks about humidity, airflow. That is like the sort of top case scenario. But most of these as houseplants, if you're not trying to make them into some sort of ornamental plant for your house, just keep them on the windowsill, give them the light, give them a bit of water, and you're just trying to keep them alive. And if you do that, then hopefully come spring you should have a good head start on some of these plants. So to summarize, overwintering Colocasia is generally about variety. That will determine what method you have, also what space you have to actually store them and get them through winter. If you haven't got much space, you'll probably go for dry storing, or maybe the dormancy method. If you've got a greenhouse or a nice sunny windowsill and you want to keep them growing at higher temperatures, then maybe that's the method for you. Some people are going to look at this video and basically saying you don't need to go to that extent, and that is fair enough. Sometimes you don't, but over the sort of last 10 to 13 years, I've grown many varieties and collected them, some of which I've lost through winters and could probably never get hold of again. So I'm now using methods that reliably for my conditions work for me, and hopefully maybe a couple of these ideas help you get your Colocasias through the winter wherever you live. If you've got any comments, please leave it at the end. If you've got any different ideas on how you use yours and what works for you, please let me know. Always happy to discuss these plants. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you want to. Cheers.